I always give it a few minutes to make sure there's no like technical issues and ask my followers
Sure.
like, is the sound good? I had
Right.
had a few conversations where there were some issues and I didn't realize it till like 20 minutes into
Oh,
the stream. You're like, oh no.
that's so frustrating.
Yeah.
I tape a 15-minute voice thread and then realize nothing came through. It's like, oh, crumbs.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, it's so difficult to be like, I put in so much work and then I have to restart. All right, it looks like we're live.
Okay.
How is the sound? Joy sound? Question mark. Oh, could you testing just make some noise so they can hear you?
Testing, testing. Vikings are better than the Broncos these days.
Vikings are still terrible though. All right, it
Hey,
looks like we're good. What?
they went a long ways in the playoffs. I mean, they made it to the playoffs and then they won a game.
Yeah. All right, it looks like we're live. So, Dr. Bloomberg,
Okay.
thank you for coming on and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, I'm 64 years old. I'm a native of Rock Island, Illinois. Um, Went to college in my hometown, Augustana College, and then spent a year teaching high school math on Chicago's North Shore. Um, but then went to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for seminary, met my wife there. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary. So you can do the math and figure out we were married at 24. And then 3 weeks after we were married in the late summer of 79, we left for a 3 year honeymoon in Aberdeen, Scotland, called PhD studies. And from there, got a job at Palm Beach Atlantic College, now university, in West Palm Beach, Florida, for 3 years. We're back in the UK doing some work with the University and College's Christian Fellowship for a year, and came to Denver in 1986. And while we've been privileged to be able to go a lot of different places around the world, we keep coming back to Denver. And this has become our home. We raised both of our two daughters here. One went off to London for university and met and married a British man. So we've lost her. And she has our only three grandchildren. So we get over there as often as we can. And our other daughter just finished a PhD in molecular biology at the University of Pennsylvania and is looking for work in her field.
Cool. So I
Looking
invited.
for work
Oops.
in her field.
So I invited you on because I was interested in researching the historicity of the Bible and miracles and how in history they address miracle claims and other claims like miracles, like magic and UFOs and mythical creatures and those kinds of things. Would you mind giving us a little bit of background? Like, how does history assess miraculous claims, and can they assess miraculous claims, or do they? Is it something outside of the
Yeah,
grounds of history?
well, it depends on which branch of history or which historian you ask. There certainly would be
Something
a
outside.
lot of folks who would say the best we can do is assess the testimony that's available. If it's recent history, you might be able to talk to an alleged eyewitness. If it's ancient history, you have to go back to documents and assess their merits. And there would be a lot of historians who would say the most that we can say is that people said this is what happened, and they did not have any naturalistic explanation for it, and therefore they attribute it to God. There would be others, not just Christian historians, and actually some Christian historians would fall into that first camp. But there would be others, and a few who are not Christians, who would say, no, that's unfair to bracket God out of the picture a priori, and therefore there are times when we say, no, we can never know for sure what the source of some unusual event is, but there might be times when the most probable explanation out of several is that there was divine agency.
So my position is like if I told you I saw a unicorn yesterday, it doesn't seem to me like no matter how detailed an explanation I can give of how great the unicorn is or how many hairs it has or whatever, it doesn't seem like that would convince you that unicorns actually exist. So from my interpretation, it does seem like the methodology of history as being limited to testimony does seem to bracket off the capability to justify things like miracles, magic, mythical creatures, or anything that doesn't have like an empirical basis of some kind. Just because the testimony on its own wouldn't convince someone like that I saw a unicorn or that unicorns were real.
Well, if I thought you were a trustworthy person, if you had a good track record, and I questioned you, were you smoking pot? No. And a bunch of other things, and you seemed absolutely serious and of sound mind, I might conclude that you saw something. And as best as you could tell, it resembled what you have come to understand a unicorn looked like. It's funny you use that example because I remember just a couple of years ago, an article online that caught my attention because it said something like how scientists discovered the unicorn question mark. And there was reference to skeletal findings and such. And at the end of the day, the answer was no, they haven't, but couldn't even tell you what species of equine they related it to. There was some kind of horse or predecessor of a horse who did seem to have an unusually large bump on its head. Um, and the possibility of scientists finding evidence for creatures that we don't know about, whether it's a new species of dinosaur or whatever, does seem to be very probable that that'll continue to happen. So I think that's how I would go about responding to your claim.
Oh, I would totally agree on that part. Like if someone claimed to see a unicorn and then later scientists discovered like the body of a unicorn or fossils of a unicorn, then I think their testimony would be far more reasonable to accept. So if someone claimed to have seen a UFO and then later we discover a UFO, that
Right,
would make it reasonable to believe in the same
right.
case. And in the case of miracles and the resurrection, I would do the same thing. Is that if we have a testimony of the resurrection, and then later we discovered other kinds of miracles that we could verify in some way. Well, that would also lend credence to the resurrection claim. But until we have that secondary basis of the empirical evidence of those things, it doesn't seem reasonable to believe it purely based off of the testimony.
Well, and again, with the resurrection, there would be a lot of people who would agree with you. There is a remarkable pair of books written in the 90s by a then professor of history at the University of Bonn. He's been retired now for some years, by the name of Gerd Ludemann, who was a very outspoken atheist. But what made his books so remarkable was he said, we can chart from the evidence of the New Testament itself and logical inferences from it that people believed in the bodily resurrection of Jesus within at most a year or two, and perhaps within months or weeks of his death. Then, very candidly, he said, of course, I come with the presupposition that such a thing cannot happen. And so I look for the next best explanation, which has to be that they had some kind of subjective experience that some people would call it hallucinations. He didn't like that word because that suggests drugs or something else, but that they just had some kind of powerful subjective experience that wouldn't have been recorded if people had a ability to videotape back then. And that convinced them of the truth of his being alive again. Then there are others who argue with that and say, well, does that really adequately account for the rise of Christian faith, particularly in a context where Jesus' first followers and quite a few off and on thereafter faced intense persecution for their beliefs? Would something that was merely a subjective experience be strong enough to keep that going? And that's where the debate continues.
Well, that's the part I'm really curious about because, from my perspective, I don't think it's reasonable to rule out resurrection or God at all. I think it's perfectly reasonable to keep that in as a possible explanation. But I don't think that the testimony alone is reasonable to justify that as the more plausible or reasonable explanation to go to. So, from my example, if I told you I saw a unicorn, like I wouldn't rule out the possibility of unicorns. It's always possible, but I don't think that kind of evidence on its own is sufficient to get to the conclusion unicorns exist, regardless of like how much I was persecuted or how powerful my subjective experience
Right.
was. So, I agree we shouldn't ever rule out the resurrection or God a priori. I think that's totally unreasonable. But I don't think that that kind of evidence is reasonable to support the conclusion that it did happen. And then you mentioned like, well, would it be what is the sufficient alternative to explain the rise of Christianity? I mean, I'm not sure how does that relate in this debate to the resurrection because saying the resurrection happened and saying people believe the resurrection happened, I don't see any sufficient difference between those two. Why would be one be more plausible to explain
Yeah.
Christianity than the other?
Well, I know analogies break down sooner or later, but let's see how far we can push the unicorn analogy. Suppose it wasn't just you. Suppose a dozen of your closest friends and another 500 people in completely unrelated places all claim to have the same experience, and every one of them checked out as seemingly reliable, plausible individuals. But then they began going around telling people that seeing this unicorn has changed their lives. And instead of being terrified by totalitarian authorities, they spoke out boldly in the public square. But not only that, their lives were changed for the better. And they were working to help their communities and in their own personal lives. They were more caring, more compassionate, more loving people. And 2,000 years later, this movement that they started had grown to be the largest such movement on the planet. I think that's the analogy. And you say, okay, let's go back to the beginning. Um, it was more than Tom just being convinced he saw a unicorn.
So my interpretation on that would be, well, one, the size of the group that follows them, I don't think that makes their claim more plausible. I don't think the number of people who believe them makes it more plausible in the end, like 1,000 years later, however many people believe them. And I'm not sure that whether or not they were persecuted makes them more plausible, because we have examples of today's society where there were like a certain number of people who saw something like UFOs. We definitely have hundreds, even thousands of accounts of people seeing UFOs or Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or those kinds of things, even in groups. And they go around talking about their experiences and trying to get newspapers and news articles, and they are persecuted for their beliefs to some extent, depending on where they are, more or less. Like in China, significantly more than here. But
Right.
I don't think that any of that lends credence to their claim in that sense. It just lends credence to the confidence they have in their claims.
And I suppose a couple of differences there would be in order to keep the ufology movement going, you have to have continual and repeated sightings. And if you're going to keep it going over a number of generations, then each generation needs its own claims. I take it there are some people in Roswell, New Mexico, if for no other reason than it makes good money for them, that like to keep the myth of a flying saucer having landed there in the 1950s. And we even saw a little museum, but it hasn't turned into any kind of religious movement. And in fact, over time, I have a good friend who's from Roswell, and she tells me that yeah, the interest is dying down, and another generation there may be nothing there, unless there were to be something to keep it going. um, I wonder though, when you say the number of witnesses, especially when at least some of them were independent, if that wouldn't affect you if we were talking about something unrelated to a religious claim. If you have uh, multiple independent testimony to a very unusual event. That's pretty much the staple of historians doing research in the ancient world on any topic. And if you just have a single witness, especially if there's some reason to suspect that witness, you're going to be much more confident about something if there are multiple independent witnesses.
Well, I'd still apply it to the unicorn case because we have multiple independent witnesses of UFOs, many of them in many different situations, especially like pilots who have claimed to see UFOs, and it's a fairly common occurrence. But that doesn't increase my belief or my confidence that UFOs are actually aliens or anything like that. It just means that there are people who see these kinds of experiences and have experiences they can't explain, and then attribute something to that experience, which is usually where the breakdown occurs. So I don't think that because of how feeble our testimony is, and like we do like to make those kinds of inferences from we experience something unusual that we can't explain to, well, I'm going to explain it now because I can come up with this explanation.
Yeah.
That tendency that we have makes our testimony very unreliable, which is why we need that extra empirical basis before we can actually be justified in believing that those other new category of things actually exist in this world.
And just to keep the examples as parallel as possible, I think you'd have to say that it was one specific UFO that could be described in minute detail, and that there were multiple independent witnesses to that, and that somehow that experience transformed their lives because they believed that, well, let's make the analogy this way. They were continuing to receive communications from the UFO, and that for generation after generation, up to a couple billion people today, if the censuses are accurate, have claimed to have that kind of experience. And yeah, we all know about the big screw ups and the people who flamed out and not done justice to their cause, but overall, remarkable amount of good has been accomplished through this, which I don't see any analogy to with ufologists. Now, having said all that, there would still be people. I remember having an uncle who, when my father's sister, who had lived with poorly set, multiply fractured ankle going all the way back to the 1930s when she was a young woman. And she had lived with, lived with this for 40 years. And then through the ministry of a faith healer who at least a previous generation of people would know, and I think a lot of people have still heard of the name, had a seemingly miraculous overnight transformation. She lived another 20 years, never had pain in her ankle again. And I was an 18-year-old boy when this happened, and I thought, my goodness, this is the first time in my life. I've heard about this stuff, but this is the first time in my life somebody close to me has actually experienced this. She had been a nominal Methodist, but this got her going back to church. She became active. She became a strong believing Christian as a result of this. But I can still remember sitting in her and my uncle's home the first time we visited them after all this happened. And my uncle listened and nodded and said, there's just so much about the power of mind over matter that we don't know. And I thought to myself, yeah, that takes at least as much, if not more, faith than believing in God worked a miracle.
Well, there's a couple things you said there I wanted to touch on. One was that the amount of goodness that they, or the betterment of their lives in some sense. I mean, do you consider that to be evidence, the fact that that it had a certain kind of an outcome over their life over another? Like, why is the goodness of their life considered evidence at all?
Well, it wouldn't necessarily, but when somebody asks a person, if I change the example and think now of a friend who lives in Seattle but lived in Denver for 25 years, he was the the FBI told him unofficially, we don't keep records of this, but unofficially, you and your partner successfully robbed more banks than anybody in history. And he was thrown in jail. And through a chaplain here in one of the Denver jails, had a dramatic conversion experience. And when he got out after serving, got out early for good behavior, but I think he was 7, 8, 9 years still. He devoted the next 20 years of his life to feeding the homeless here in Denver. Now, is there a cause and effect relationship there? The only way I know that is by asking him. And his testimony, which I don't have any particular reason to doubt, especially after all that time, is that it's because Jesus came and forgave him of his sins and came to live in his life and prompted him to do all this.
Well, I'd say the same thing about Jains or very pacifist Buddhists of being, if you become very um, attached to an ideology that advocates for peace and helping others in humanism or secular humanism, I have the same similar kinds of examples where you get into a certain community who has those values, and it causes a very big change in your life where you start to be more helping of others and devote your life to helping the people around you. But I don't think that lends any credence to the truth of that ideology, just the fact that you're attached to it to some degree.
If you would say that the reason for your change is because of watching other people um, and other people telling you this would be a good thing for you to do. But if you are by yourself in a prison cell and have an opportunity to read a Bible, and I think to go into more of John's story, he did have that opportunity, and he simply sat down and read the New Testament pretty much from start to finish without much of a break. And at the end of the day, said, "This is true. I'm convinced this is true. Jesus, I surrender my life to you." And it was only much later that the whole range of factors that the Christian movement contributed began to even be anything that he knew. He had nothing but an atheist upbringing. So I do think in a situation like that, there are some differences.
From my perspective, it's like when if you're in a prison cell or locked away and you read some really inspiring work that really means something to you, like the works of Nelson Mandela and his biography, those things can have a huge impact on you if you emotionally relate with the ideas being expressed in the book, and that can have a profound impact on how you change your life. But I don't think, again, I don't think that lends credence to the truth of the document. I mean, it may be a fictional document, maybe like Lord of the Rings or something, and the fact that it had some profound impact on your life and you believe it's real doesn't make it more likely that the document you're reading is true. I don't see how that's actually evidence that actually makes it more plausible. Just because it had a change in your life, I don't think that makes it more likely to be true.
I don't suppose anybody goes around saying Nelson Mandela has come to live in my heart. But no, I think the point you are making, and we're taking several different lines of argument. We're talking about ancient history and how you study that. We're talking about personal transformation. We're talking about the experience of movement over a prolonged period of time. And I think the most powerful arguments really are a combination of all of those and others that we haven't broached, rather than any one, which, if it were the only phenomenon, would not be nearly as strong. I think you're right.
Another example would be like, suppose Islam continues to grow at the rate it is, and it becomes the biggest religion in the world,
Right.
and then the Quran becomes the most common book at jail cells and per churches, and
Could
then
happen.
people reading those books have a change in their life because we do know that people reading the Quran do have similar changes in different areas of the world, positively and negatively,
Right. Right.
and then they would have similar experiences. Do you think that those combinations of things would lend credence or make Islam more likely to be true than Christianity or tip the balances
if
in some way.
if you could combine it with the same kind of historical evidence. It's interesting when you compare the Quran. I don't know how much of either the Quran or the Bible you've read, and there certainly are a handful of parallels here and there, and some of the same characters who appear here and there. But the major literary difference is that the Bible is a collection of 66 books, most of which were written by different people at different times, some of them in full knowledge of works that were written in previous eras that had come to be deemed as sacred by their religious communities, and some of them not. And when you put them together, you have what philosophers would call a meta-narrative. There are sections of the Bible that are not narrative in form, laws, Proverbs, Psalms, and so forth. But overall, there is a comprehensive story that begins with creation and ends with new creation. And when you look at the books, the sacred books of the other world religions, you can certainly find parallels to somebody talking about creation and somebody talking about the end of the world and so forth and so on. But none of them is comprised of one overarching story that has a remarkable amount of unity from start to finish that at least makes the claim, whether you accept it or not, to be a comprehensive explanation of why we're here, what our purpose is, where this world is going. The Quran is interesting because the arrangement of the surahs is according to length. Surah is like a glorified long chapter of a book of the Bible. And so you have the longest down to the shortest. And therefore, episodes from the life of Muhammad are in no chronological order necessarily. And there really isn't an overarching story that's told. Instead, it's here are what Muhammad believed were a series of revelations given to him by God, largely about the way people should or shouldn't live. And you just don't get that comprehensive kind of explanation. You don't get multiple independent witnesses. Muhammad is the putative sole author or receiver of the revelation. It all came from during his lifetime. And then there is that remarkable fact that Muslims often don't know, and when they do, they don't like to be reminded of it, that when Muhammad died, there were multiple copies of the Quran that apparently were so divergent from each other that Muhammad's successors destroyed all but one copy, and then worked very diligently to preserve that one copy as best as possible. And the question has to come, what were in all of those other copies that were destroyed?
Oh, right, absolutely. There's also questions about, like, I remember at some point in the history of the Quran, there was that one guy who collected all the different manuscripts, destroyed all of them, and rewrote it himself. So, but that was my question originally, is just that the amount of people who believe it and the fact that it has an impact on people's lives doesn't seem to be evidence for the truth of the claim. And even if we add in your additional criterion that it has a complete narrative, so if you have a book that has a complete narrative and it becomes the majority population or the majority belief system, like Islam potentially, and it causes people's lives to be changed because it's the most common book in prisons, it has the most reach, people happen to read it a lot, so it seems like it's going to have the most likely impact on people's lives just purely by random chance. But none of that seems to be indicative of its truth at all. I don't think those just seem to be like happenstance kind of things, not truth kinds of things.
And add one more piece to it, and that is that the narrative portions are about real human beings who really lived, who themselves believed that God led them, at times spoke to them, guided them, rebuked them. The Old Testament is remarkable because of all the religious literature of the world. It is most candid about the failures of its people. And then it all is summed up in an individual who, both in the fulfillment of predictions made hundreds of years earlier and in what we're debating, seemingly miraculous events, brought to fruition, became what his followers believed was the culmination of everything to which history had been pointing. And people went off and continued to have that same spiritual experience, and occasionally with actual visual and auditory miracles, but for most of us, just profound spiritual conviction that a power has entered and overtaken our lives that has transformed us. Can all of that put together, if one starts from a position of skepticism, necessarily overcome that skepticism? No. And that's why Christians, at least, have also said people have to be open to the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God has to touch them and woo them and bring them to Himself. And sometimes somebody fights against God his whole life, and when he finally gets or she gets a terminal diagnosis of some kind, has a very different transformation. But no, if you have had people on, I haven't watched all your videos, but if you've had people on who have said, I can give knockdown conclusive proof that a court of law would establish as beyond reasonable doubt, no, I think Christians are foolish to claim that level of confidence. And I think there are two theological reasons, but I don't have to describe them theologically. One is that we are all finite, and therefore there's tons we don't know. And the other is that we are what theological people would say fallen, sinful. If those words aren't congenial, then we just make a heck of a lot of mistakes and screw up and treat other people badly and don't think right. And so, yeah, to be able to say anything based on historical claims at the foundation can be proved like you'd prove a geometric theorem. No, that's not reasonable. But then most of what I do in life is not based on that kind of proof. I was just talking with a class earlier this week saying, I have had, maybe I've got a weak stomach. I don't know. Maybe I don't pick my restaurants very well, but it seems like about once every 2 years, I eat out someplace and get really bad food poisoning. And that does have an impact on which restaurants I go back to. And I'm sure the chances are good that I could go back to some of them and never have the same experience, but I'm not going to risk it. But it doesn't stop me from eating out. And so when I go into any restaurant, could I convince a jury that what I'm about to eat is not going to give me food poisoning? I suspect I couldn't. But I make decisions that affect major parts of my life all the time based on what seems reasonable and probable rather than what I can show mathematically is conclusive.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. So proof only exists in math and logic. So that's
Thank you. Thank
no,
you.
that's totally beyond the capability of essentially anything in science. Science can never prove anything with absolute certainty. It's all about probabilities.
I've
But
met so many people who dispute that. So thank you.
but yeah, like the example of a court case. I really like the court case example because do you think the examples you give would be allowed as evidence in a court case or be compelling in a court case? Because I don't think they would be. I think that in many court cases, there are those kinds of evidences, and specifically evidences for miracles and magic and mythical creatures. There have been tons of court cases about those specific things, and it doesn't seem like that kind of evidence of testimony is allowed in a court case for the same reasons the historians you mentioned at the beginning who don't accept historical testimony as being reliable evidence for
Right.
miracles. I mean, do you think that those kinds of things, the fact that it has a complete narrative, that it changed people's lives, that it was someone converted this from like reading it in a prison and it totally changed their life? Do you think, or the population, that most of the population happens to believe this after X number of
Right.
years? Do you think those would be accepted as evidence in a courtroom?
Not in a 21st century American one. However, I've done enough study of history and of current events to know that there probably are parts of the world where if the topic was Islam rather than Christianity, um, some courts would accept it. There certainly are in Christian history places both in North America and Europe in communities that were much more Christian than most of those countries have today, where it would have been accepted. So, would it be accepted in a 21st century American court? Probably not. But then I'd want to stand the question on its head. Um, it's interesting, and I don't know if you've run into this in some of the other people you've interviewed, but there's a long Christian tradition of saying, if we're going to make analogies to contemporary American court practice, then let's remember that testimony and individuals are assumed to be innocent until proven guilty. If we assumed that the biblical authors were telling the truth, would there be enough evidence to overturn that and prove that they were guilty of lying or deceit or fraud? And so, if you want to make an analogy with a court, I think that might be the better way to ask the question.
Well, absolutely, for sure. But from my perspective, the way the court interprets the innocent until proven guilty, it's about the burden of proof and the I forget what it's called. The starting point is essentially nothing new happened. I think that's the summary of it. But so it would be like we start with everything we know we have a pretty solid foundation on, the common accepted framework, and then we say nothing new is the basis. That's like the burden of proof standard. If you want to say something is new on this list of things we already accept, that's the innocent. That thing is doesn't exist until demonstrated otherwise, or it's innocent until proven guilty. So in that case, it would seem like the burden of proof would be on the one claiming that the resurrection happened. It wouldn't be
Yeah.
claiming that the apostles didn't lie or something like that. Because we would, I'm sure most historians seem to grant that the apostles actually believed what they said. They're not like deliberately lying or anything. They're just, I think more would think that they were just under a delusion or had a misapprehension or something. But I tend to think they were telling the truth, that that's what they believed. But if you want to say that's what they actually saw, then that
Right.
claim would need extra kind of evidence. That claim would be imaginary till demonstrated otherwise, or something like that.
And that interestingly is one of the famous Scottish philosopher David Hume's three key arguments for naturalism, and people who responded in his world said, well, there is good testimony from countless places in the world of unexplainable things happening directly after concerted public Christian prayer in a way that we don't see, for that matter, happening certainly to the same degree or with the same clarity with prayer to any other gods or in any other religious traditions. And Hume, if you read more than the parts that the philosophy textbooks usually quote, had some pretty racist things to say about how barbaric the peoples were that these claims were typically, not always, but typically found in. Today, you may be familiar with a 2-volume work by a biblical scholar named Craig
Craig
Keener,
Keener, yeah.
which is just remarkable because he and his Congolese wife wrote a little autobiography to describe very hair-raising experiences to avoid murder in the war in Congo a number of years ago. But because of Craig's erudition and their networking, They have received thousands upon thousands of accounts of miracles parallel to every kind of miracle that you find in the New Testament, certainly healings and exorcisms being by far the most common. And they have gone through and eliminated most of the reports they've received, because only where there is a credible level of documentation, as well as close parallels to what we see in the New Testament. And he still publishes 400 to 500 examples, some of which he's been personally involved in. I could tell you a couple stories of when I've been involved in praying over people with the MRIs in their folders showing the giant tumors. And when they went back to their doctors the next week, there was no sign of any tumor. That's not the norm. Otherwise, we'd stop calling it a miracle. And at some point, and I guess the threshold is different for every person. You say, "Gosh, it's harder not to believe that there's a God doing this than to believe that there is one."
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I would not take Hume's position. I don't think that it's reasonable to say that a miracle is always the least reasonable thing to
Oh,
assume
good.
happened.
Oh, good.
My position would be more like in the Craig Keener case, is that when we try to replicate those studies, all of the miracle studies that have been done in scientific labs seem to come up as negative results. They don't seem to have any positive results there. And we would expect that if praying to the Christian God would have more of an effect than the other gods, then we would see some kind of a difference when we do those tests, and we don't. It doesn't seem to happen. So there's lots
And
of strange things that we can see all over the world that we can't explain, absolutely.
right.
But to conclude that this is due causally related to the Christian God, well, we should be able to replicate that in some sense, and we
I'm
haven't been
not
able
sure
to
we
do that.
should. I'm not sure we should if we also take the biblical claim into account that God does not want to coerce anyone into belief. If I could predict and replicate under laboratory conditions, well, then we'd no longer call it a miracle. We'd call it some new form of science. But then there really would be no rational reason left for anyone not to believe. And if one walks into the biblical story, you alluded to the Lord of the Rings, so let's pretend we're walking along with Frodo for a little while and accept his worldview, and then you can back out of it later. Um, the biblical story is that the reason there is something rather than nothing is because there is a God who created it. I'm not going to make any claims about how, when, or how old. I'm not a young earth creationist, you may be happy to know. But he so valued freely given love relationships among beings that shared enough qualities with himself that Genesis could talk about them being created in his image, that he made it possible for humans to come into existence and to know him, but to avoid robotics, to avoid the compulsion that being able to replicate something in a laboratory would seemingly require for all but psychologically imbalanced people. He gave enough evidence for belief, but not enough evidence to compel it. That, to me, within the system at least, seems to be a good answer. Jesus was on more than one occasion asked for a sign. And on one occasion, he had just, so the story goes, fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And he was asked for a sign. And within the story, within the worldview, you want to ask, what more could you possibly want? Um, and yet, I have met people who themselves have been believers and have experienced what they once would have said um, was foolproof testimony to God working miracles in their lives. But then, for tragic reasons, suicide of a family member, somebody in the name of Jesus abusing them horribly, they've given it all up. And you say, what about what you experienced? Oh, well, I don't know. It must have been something else. And so, even in a situation like that, God never compels belief that can't be changed because he values our freely given love.
Well, to bring up the example you used earlier, like when we look at the court case today in modern American society,
Right.
um, do you think that the standards that uses are unfair? Because we used to accept magic, like the witchcraft, the Salem witch trials, where there were testimony
Yeah.
of
No, I wouldn't
things.
want to go back to that.
So, but when we compare that to the other societies today, it seems like the standard we use in the Western culture seems to be a pretty reasonable standard. Do you think that?
Oh, yeah, I think so. Because what we're normally trying to determine is did somebody commit a crime or not? We're not normally bringing miracle stories in ancient books to modern judges and juries. So I suppose the other way to reply to your question of you like to use the analogy of modern court cases is maybe that's not so good of an analogy when we're talking about ancient history and miracle claims.
Okay, that's fair. So, what do you think is a better standard to use?
Everything we've been talking about. um, Detailed study of ancient history, detailed study of church history, detailed study of transformation of persons, and absolutely don't limit it to Christianity. Um, I had a I don't know, say a good friend, but at least a close acquaintance a number of years ago who kept challenging me on this issue of, but aren't there equally miraculous claims in all the world's religions? And I started investigating it, and the answer is no. There are a few in most religions. Um, in many cases, they were added hundreds of years after the life of the founder. The only religion that even begins to come close to the frequency of miracles in Christianity is Hinduism. And then you look at, well, what kinds of miracles? And they tend to be experiences that um, permit people to think that they must have lived in a prior life. Well, that's another whole fascinating topic I'd love to delve into, but that's not the kind of miracle you find anywhere in the Bible. So, um, yeah, look at the testimony of history of Christian people, and by all means, look at other religions as well, and compare and contrast them.
Or would you say the same thing about, for example, the Norse mythology or the Roman gods? Because they actually
Sure,
had quite a few interactions with humans, apparently, from the stories.
they did, but they were never with humans who had recently lived. They were always with people from the distant past, or if there was a story about someone who had recently lived, it was most likely to be an apotheosis, a declaration of their deity after their death, but not. They didn't invent stories that um, these people did while they were alive that those who were still alive could easily have disproved.
Well, weren't there quite a few testimonies of things like you angered the gods, therefore you angered Poseidon, therefore he sunk your ship, and they caused this storm or whatever? It seems like, or you angered
Oh,
Zeus,
sure.
and therefore this he burned down your home with a lightning strike.
Yeah, and I assume that when we're talking about Christian miracles, we're not talking about Pat Robertson praying the hurricane away from the East Coast like he claimed back in the 80s. There are all those kinds of coincidence that some people will call miracles, and there is that looser use of miracle. I'm not going to go on a vendetta saying that every time a team that was 4-12 turns itself around and might win the Super Bowl, that it's a miracle. But I understand what people mean when they say that.
Well, yeah, but
Uh,
that's what's the difference between those claims and the experience of the disciples? Like, for example, if you experience something that you see as really profound that has an impact on your life, like assumedly Poseidon sinking your ship, and then you're like, okay, I'm going to take Poseidon seriously now, and that can completely change my life. Isn't that the same kind of a thing that the disciples could have experienced, where they experienced a natural kind of a thing like a bereavement delusion, which we know are extremely common, and they
if
see.
all you had was the resurrection, but you have water changed into wine, you have the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, you have Jesus walking on water, you have countless people who were invalids for years who are spontaneously healed. You have people with demons cast out of them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, yeah, take one item here, one item there. Um, but I do think there is a cumulative case. And I do have to mention that I'm needing to leave very
Okay.
quickly for another appointment.
Oh, absolutely. I don't want to take you. So, but I did want to ask one last question, which was, do you
Sure.
take all of those miracle claims to be literal and not kind of like apocryphal or just embellished? Do you think all of those actually
Metaphorical.
happened? Yes, metaphorical.
There's one that intrigues me because it stands out as very different. And the far right in the Christian movement hates to hear people say this, but it hasn't stopped me. And that is the 4 verse account in Matthew 17 at the end of the chapter that says that Jesus started a brief discussion with Peter about who should be taxed, and should it be the sons of a king or their subjects? And well, it should be their subjects. And he uses that as a way to imply that Jews shouldn't be paying tax to Rome. Um, but then he says, so as not to cause offense, go to the lake, throw in your line, and the first fish you catch will have a two-stater coin in its mouth, and that will be the exact amount to pay the tax for you and me. End of passage. It doesn't say whether Peter even went. It doesn't say if he went, if he threw his line in the lake. It doesn't say if he threw his line in the lake, if he caught a fish. It doesn't say if he caught a fish, he found the coin in his mouth. So there, I suspect maybe we do have something that's not meant to be taken literally, that's meant to be some kind of a metaphorical way, um, maybe of saying, use the spare money from your fishing business. I don't know, but the fact is that the literary form is so different. And then there is that bizarre passage of um, people when the earthquake shook the ground, shook the cemetery at Jesus' death, who after Jesus' resurrection also came out of the tombs and appeared to many in the holy city. End of story. Who were they? Where did they appear? Who saw them? What did they do? How long did they stick around? None of the information that we do get, like in the stories of Jesus' resurrection. And it's only Matthew that tells us that. Could that be what scholars call an apocalyptic passage, meant to teach what Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 would say very prosaically, that Christ is the first fruits of those who have died, and that his resurrection means that believers can look forward to bodily resurrection at the end of the age. Again, you have something that the actual literary form is so dramatically different from the standard miracle that maybe you and your followers will be happy to hear I don't treat all of them identically.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation, but I'll
Well,
let
thank
you go so
you.
you can get to your meeting.
Thank you for such wonderful and thoughtful questions. I've had a number of these kind of conversations in a number of different venues with atheist people, and yours has by far been the best. So keep up the good work.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Good.
Have a nice
Take
day.
care.